James Walker was a 10-year-old boy with messy brown hair and vibrant green eyes that sparkled with curiosity. He lived in a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago with his mother, Laura, a hard-working single mom in her early 30s. The apartment was small, with creaky wooden floors and faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. It wasn't much, but Laura had made it a home filled with warmth and love. Family photos hung on the walls, and James's colorful drawings were taped to the fridge, making the place uniquely theirs. Life wasn't easy for Laura and James. Laura worked long hours as a waitress at a local diner, often coming home late, smelling of coffee and fried food. Despite her exhaustion, she always made time for James. Every night, they would sit together at the rickety kitchen table, eating simple meals while talking about their day. It was during these moments that James's boundless compassion and sense of adventure often shone through. "Mom, do you think we could ever get a dog?" James asked one evening, poking at his mac and cheese with a fork. His eyes were hopeful but cautious, as if he already knew the answer. Laura sighed, setting her coffee mug down. "Sweetheart, you know how much I'd love that. But taking care of a dog costs money we don't have right now. Food, vet visits, all of it." James nodded, trying to mask his disappointment. "Yeah, I figured. It's just, I see people with dogs at the park, and they always look so happy. I think I'd be good at taking care of one." Laura reached across the table, placing her hand gently over his. "You have the biggest heart of anyone I know, James. Someday, you'll make a wonderful dog owner. We just have to be patient, okay?" "Okay, Mom," he replied, forcing a small smile. James's love for animals was well known in their neighborhood. Stray cats seemed to gravitate toward him, and he was always the first to volunteer to help a neighbor walk their dog or feed their fish. He even kept a small notebook where he wrote facts about different breeds of dogs, drawing pictures of his favorites in the margins. His dream was simple yet profound, to have a dog of his own to love and care for. Despite their financial struggles, James and Laura found joy in the little things. They would take walks through the local park, where James often chased squirrels and stopped to pet every dog they encountered. He was endlessly curious, always asking questions about the world around him. "Why do dogs wag their tails, Mom?" he asked one afternoon as they sat on a bench, sharing a bag of pretzels. Laura chuckled. "It's their way of showing they're happy, kind of like how you smile when you're excited." James grinned, popping a pretzel into his mouth. "I'd wag my tail all the time if I had one." Laura laughed, ruffling his hair. "You're something else, kiddo." Their neighborhood, though rough around the edges, was a place of resilience. The streets were lined with small businesses, many with chipped paint and hand-painted signs. James had grown up there, learning to appreciate the community's grit and heart. But it was also a place where danger wasn't far away, a reality Laura tried to shield him from as much as possible. Late at night, James would often sit by his bedroom window, staring out at the city lights. He imagined what it would be like to have a big yard, a dog to play fetch with, and a life without the constant weight of financial worry. But even in his young mind, he knew that dreaming didn't change reality. What he didn't know was that life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. It was a chilly autumn afternoon when James set out to run an errand for his mom. Laura had handed him a short grocery list: milk, bread, eggs, and a crumpled $20 bill, reminding him to bring back the receipt and change. The streets of their neighborhood were bustling with the usual sights and sounds. The clatter of passing trains on the elevated tracks, the hum of cars, and the occasional shout of a street vendor. James hummed to himself as he walked, his sneakers scuffing against the cracked sidewalk. He liked running errands. It made him feel responsible, like he was helping his mom in some small way. As he turned down a quieter street, the air changed. A faint, acrid smell hit his nose, sharp and unmistakable: smoke. Frowning, James glanced around. A thin column of gray smoke curled up from an alley a few yards ahead. His heart quickened as curiosity battled with caution. He hesitated, hearing his mom's voice in his head. "Don't wander into places you don't know." But something about the smoke felt urgent, like someone, or something, might be in trouble. Taking a deep breath, James stepped into the alley. The smell of burning rubber grew stronger, and the air felt hotter the farther he walked. His eyes scanned the narrow passage, cluttered with overflowing trash bins and discarded boxes. Near the far end of the alley, he spotted the source of the smoke. A pile of garbage was smoldering, flames licking at its edges. But what made James's stomach drop wasn't the fire. It was the dog. A golden retriever was tied to a metal post just a few feet from the fire. Its coat, a beautiful shade of honey gold, was matted and dirty. The dog was barking frantically, pulling at its leash, its eyes wide with fear. James could see the flames creeping closer, the heat making the air shimmer. "Oh no," James whispered, his feet moving before his brain could catch up. He dashed toward the dog, his heart pounding. "Hey buddy, it's okay. I'm here." The dog barked louder as James approached, its body trembling. "Sure, it's okay," James said softly, crouching down. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I promise." The leash was a knotted mess, tangled around the post. James's fingers fumbled as he tried to undo it, his movements frantic but careful. The heat was unbearable now, sweat dripping down his forehead. The fire crackled louder, sending sparks into the air. Come on, James muttered, his hands shaking. The dog whimpered, its ears flattened against its head. James finally managed to free the leash, but the flames were dangerously close. Without thinking, he scooped the dog into his arms, staggering under its weight. The retriever wasn't huge, but for a 10-year-old, it was heavy. "Hang on, buddy," James said through gritted teeth, his legs burning as he sprinted toward the alley's exit. The dog buried its face against his chest, its warm breath quick and panicked. As they burst out of the alley, James collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. The dog squirmed out of his arms and immediately began licking his face, its tail wagging furiously. James laughed weakly, wiping the soot from his cheeks. "You're welcome," he said, scratching behind the dog's ears. A few bystanders had gathered, murmuring in confusion as they glanced at the boy and the dog. One of them, an older man with a cane, stepped forward. "Kid, are you okay? That was some dangerous stuff back there." "I'm fine," James said, though his voice was hoarse and his hands were trembling. He looked down at the golden retriever, who was now sitting calmly by his side, its big brown eyes full of gratitude. But he could have been hurt. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. Someone must have called the fire department. James gave the dog a reassuring pat. "We're safe now," he said quietly. As the fire truck pulled up, James couldn't help but wonder who had left the dog there and why. The firefighters worked quickly to extinguish the blaze, their shouts and the hiss of water filling the air. James sat on the curb, his heart still pounding as the adrenaline slowly ebbed away. The golden retriever leaned against him, its head resting on his lap. Its soft, warm fur was a comforting contrast to the cold, hard pavement beneath him. "You're a brave one, aren't you?" James murmured, stroking the dog's ears. The retriever wagged its tail in response, its trust in James already apparent despite the chaos it had just endured. A firefighter approached, his yellow gear streaked with soot. He knelt down to James's level, his kind eyes scanning the boy for injuries. "You okay, kid? That was a gutsy move back there." James nodded. "I'm fine. Just tired." The firefighter smiled, nodding toward the dog. "And how about your friend here? He looks like he's sticking to you like glue." James glanced at the retriever, who gave a small bark as if in agreement. "I think he's okay, but he was really scared." The firefighter patted the dog gently. "Well, you both made it out in one piece, thanks to you. Not many kids would have run into a situation like that." James felt his cheeks flush with a mix of pride and embarrassment. "I just couldn't leave him there." As the commotion began to settle, a sleek black SUV screeched to a halt nearby. The driver's side door swung open, and a tall man in his late 30s stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement as he hurried over. His face was a mixture of panic and relief as his eyes locked on the golden retriever. "Buddy," the man called out, his voice tinged with desperation. The dog's ears perked up, and it bounded toward the man, barking excitedly. James watched as the retriever leapt into the man's arms, tail wagging furiously. The man knelt, embracing the dog tightly, his relief palpable. "Oh, thank God," the man murmured, burying his face in the dog's fur. After a moment, he looked up, his sharp blue eyes landing on James. "Are you the one who saved him?" James stood awkwardly, brushing ash off his jeans. "Yeah, I saw the fire and I couldn't just leave him." The man approached, holding Buddy's leash firmly in one hand. Up close, he looked even more polished, but there was an exhaustion in his features, like someone who worked too much and slept too little. "I don't even know what to say. Thank you. You have no idea how much Buddy means to me." James shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "It's okay. I just didn't want him to get hurt." "No, it's not just okay," the man insisted, extending a hand. "I'm David Monroe. And you are?" "James Walker," he replied, shaking David's hand. He felt the man's firm grip, a stark contrast to his own small, soot-covered fingers. David glanced at Buddy, who was sitting obediently by his side now, still wagging his tail. "I don't even want to think about what could have happened if you hadn't been there." "How did you know he was in the alley?" "I saw the smoke when I was walking home," James explained. "I just wanted to check it out, and there he was, tied up near the fire." David's jaw tightened, his expression darkening. "Tied up? Someone left him there on purpose?" James nodded. "It looked like it. The leash was all tangled, and he couldn't move." David's face softened as he looked at James. "You're a hero, you know that? Most people would have just called for help and waited, but you went in there yourself." James shrugged again, shuffling his feet. "I just did what anyone would do." David shook his head. "Not anyone. You're special, kid." A firefighter interrupted, handing David a report and giving Buddy one last pat on the head. David glanced at the paper briefly before looking back at James. "Listen, James, I owe you big time. Is there anything I can do for you? Anything at all?" James hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about the groceries he still needed to pick up, the tight budget his mom always worried about. But then he glanced at Buddy, his heart swelling with the connection he'd already formed with the dog. Can I spend a day with you and Buddy?" James asked, his voice tentative. "I've always wanted to know what it's like to have a dog." David blinked, surprised by the request. Then he smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his polished exterior. "That's it? Just a day with Buddy?" James nodded, his expression earnest. "That's all." David crouched down, looking James in the eye. "You've got yourself a deal, James Walker. How about tomorrow?" James grinned, the excitement bubbling up despite his exhaustion. "Really? Really?" David said, shaking his hand again. "And trust me, this is just the beginning." The next morning, James stood outside his apartment building, the chill of the fall air biting his cheeks. His old jacket, slightly too small now, offered little protection, but he didn't care. His heart raced with excitement and nerves as he waited for David's SUV to arrive. Laura had been hesitant when James told her about the plan the night before. "You're sure it's safe?" she asked, her brow furrowed as she sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea. "Yeah, Mom." David seemed nice, and he promised he'd bring me back home before dinner, James assured her, his voice steady but hopeful. Laura sighed, reaching out to ruffle his hair. "All right, but call me if you need anything. And don't forget your manners." Now, standing on the sidewalk, James saw the sleek black SUV pull up. The tinted window on the passenger side rolled down, revealing David's smiling face. "Morning, James. Ready for your big day?" James nodded enthusiastically, climbing into the car. The leather seats were smooth and warm, and the interior smelled faintly of coffee and new car. Buddy sat in the back, his tail wagging furiously at the sight of James. "Hey, Buddy," James greeted, leaning over to scratch behind the dog's ears. Buddy responded with a happy bark, licking James's hand. David chuckled as he pulled away from the curb. "Looks like you've got a new best friend." The drive to David's estate took about 30 minutes, the scenery gradually shifting from the dense streets of the south side to the sprawling suburbs on the city's outskirts. James's eyes widened as they turned into a gated driveway lined with tall, manicured hedges. The house that came into view was massive, with large windows and a pristine white exterior. It looked like something out of a magazine. "Whoa," James whispered, his nose almost pressed against the window. "You live here?" David glanced at him, smiling. "Yeah, it's home. But it's not as exciting as it looks. You'll see." As they stepped out of the car, Buddy bounded ahead, barking joyfully as he ran across the perfectly cut grass. James followed, his sneakers sinking slightly into the lush lawn. David led him inside, where the interior of the house was even more impressive. High ceilings, polished wooden floors, and tasteful art adorned the walls. Yet, despite the luxury, the space felt oddly empty, almost too quiet. "This place is huge," James said, craning his neck to look up at a chandelier hanging in the foyer. "It's like a castle," David chuckled, setting his keys on a marble table. "It might be big, but it's just a house. Come on, let me show you around." They toured the house, moving through spacious living rooms, a library filled with books, and a kitchen that seemed too perfect to actually cook in. Finally, David led James outside to the backyard, a massive expanse with a sparkling pool, a stone patio, and a fenced area where Buddy's toys were scattered. "Wow," James said, his eyes wide. "Buddy must love it here." David smiled, leaning against the patio railing. "He does. But, a big yard and fancy toys don't mean much without good company. That's why he liked you right away. Dogs can sense a good heart." James grinned, picking up a frisbee and tossing it across the yard. Buddy bolted after it, leaping into the air to catch it before running back to James with the frisbee clamped in his jaws. They played for hours, Buddy never tiring of the game, and James laughing more than he had in months. As the day went on, David and James sat on the patio, watching Buddy nap in the sun. David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "James," David began, his voice quieter than usual, "when I was your age, I didn't have much either. My family struggled a lot. That's probably why I work so hard now. I didn't want to feel helpless again." James looked at him, surprised. "You mean you didn't grow up rich?" David shook his head. "Not even close. But sometimes, when you get caught up chasing success, you forget what really matters. People. Moments like this." He gestured toward Buddy, who was snoring softly, his paws twitching as he dreamed. James thought about his mom, how she worked so hard just to keep their small apartment running. "Yeah, my mom says it's the little things that matter. She's a wise woman," David said, smiling. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the yard. As they prepared to leave, David looked at James seriously. "I want to do something for you, James. For you and your mom. You've reminded me of what's important, and I think it's time I started making a difference." James tilted his head, confused. "What do you mean?" "You'll see," David said cryptically, his smile returning. "But I promise, it's going to be something good." The drive back to James's neighborhood was quieter than the ride out, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. Buddy had fallen asleep in the back seat, his head resting on James's lap as the boy gently petted him. David glanced at the two in the rearview mirror, a soft smile playing on his lips. As they approached the familiar streets of Southside, David broke the silence. "So, James, I've been thinking about earlier today, about how you saved Buddy. What you did wasn't just brave, it was incredible. I want to do something to thank you." James shifted uncomfortably, his fingers still running through Buddy's fur. "You don't have to do that, Mr. Monroe. I just did what anyone would have done." David shook his head, his tone firm but kind. "You might think that, but the truth is, most people wouldn't have gone into that alley, especially not a kid your age. You've got a heart that's bigger than most adults I know." James hesitated. Part of him wanted to ask for something practical, something that would help his mom, maybe a gift card for groceries or help with rent. But then he thought about Buddy and the sheer joy he'd felt spending the day with him. "Well," James started, his voice quiet, "if you really want to do something, could I spend more time with Buddy? Like, maybe visit him sometimes?" David raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "That's all you want? Time with Buddy?" James nodded quickly. "Yeah, I've always wanted a dog, but my mom and I can't afford one right now. Spending time with Buddy today was the best day I've had in a long time." David was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel as he processed James's request. Finally, he smiled. "You've got yourself a deal. But I have a better idea. How about we make this a regular thing? You can come over every weekend, spend time with Buddy, and maybe even help me take care of him." James's eyes widened. "Really? You mean it?" "Of course," David said, glancing at James in the mirror. "Buddy clearly loves you, and I think you've got a natural talent for taking care of animals. I'd be lucky to have you helping out." James couldn't hide his grin. "That would be amazing." "Thank you, Mr. Monroe. Call me David," he said with a chuckle. "And don't thank me yet. I'll be putting you to work. Feeding, grooming, training. You'll be learning all of it." "Deal," James said, his voice filled with excitement. As they pulled up to James's apartment building, Laura was waiting outside, her arms crossed and a concerned look on her face. When the SUV came to a stop, she walked over, her eyes scanning James for any signs of trouble. "James, you're late," she said, her voice tinged with worry. "I was starting to think something happened." "Sorry, Mom," James said, stepping out of the car with Buddy trotting behind him. "We lost track of time. But guess what? Mr. Monroe, David, said I can visit Buddy every weekend." Laura looked at David, her eyebrows raised. "Is that so?" David stepped out of the car, extending his hand. "You must be Laura. I'm David Monroe. James saved my dog, Buddy, yesterday. I can't thank him enough for what he did." Laura shook his hand, her expression softening slightly. "He told me about it. I'm just glad everyone's okay." David smiled. "Your son's a remarkable kid, and I'd like to repay him by giving him a chance to spend more time with Buddy. I'll make sure it's safe and supervised, of course." Laura studied David for a moment before looking at James, whose excitement was hard to ignore. She sighed, finally nodding. "All right, but James, you need to keep up with your schoolwork, okay? No skipping homework for dog visits." "I promise, Mom," James said, practically bouncing on his toes. David chuckled, reaching into his pocket to pull out a business card. "Here's my number. Call me if you ever have any questions or concerns." Laura took the card, nodding again. "Thank you, Mr. Monroe. Just David," he said with a smile. As the SUV drove away, James and Laura stood on the sidewalk, watching until it disappeared around the corner. Laura placed a hand on James's shoulder, her expression a mix of pride and affection. "You've got quite the guardian angel, huh?" she said softly. James grinned. "I guess I do." The following Saturday, James stood outside his apartment, eagerly waiting for David's SUV to pull up. He'd spent the week daydreaming about Buddy, imagining the games they'd play and the new tricks he might learn. Laura had made sure he was dressed warmly, tugging his worn jacket snugly around his shoulders before sending him off with a smile. The black SUV arrived right on time, and Buddy's face appeared in the back window, tail wagging furiously as James approached. David stepped out, greeting him with a smile. "Morning, James. Ready to get started?" James nodded eagerly. "Yes, sir." "Good," David said, opening the door for James to climb in. "Today, you're going to get a taste of what it really means to take care of a dog." The drive to David's estate felt shorter this time, perhaps because James was buzzing with excitement. When they arrived, Buddy bounded out of the car, barking happily as James followed him to the backyard. The air was crisp, and the sun cast a warm glow over the sprawling property. David handed James a leash and a small bag of treats. "All right, first things first, exercise. A dog like Buddy needs plenty of it, so we'll start with a walk around the property. Think you can handle him?" James grinned, taking the leash. "I can try." Buddy, sensing the adventure ahead, pulled eagerly at the leash as they started walking. David strolled beside James, offering tips along the way. "Keep the leash short but loose. You want to guide him, not drag him. And always watch for cues. If he starts sniffing around, he might need a break." James listened intently, adjusting his grip on the leash. By the time they returned to the backyard, Buddy was panting happily, his tail wagging non-stop. "Great job," David said, patting James on the back. "Next up, feeding time." In the kitchen, David showed James how to measure Buddy's food, explaining the importance of a balanced diet. Dogs can't eat just anything, he said, handing James the scoop. Some human foods can be really dangerous for them, like chocolate or onions. James nodded, carefully pouring the kibble into Buddy's bowl. He watched with fascination as Buddy devoured the meal, his enthusiasm contagious. The day continued with a mix of lessons and playtime. David taught James how to brush Buddy's coat, check his paws for injuries, and even practice basic obedience commands. Buddy, ever the eager student, performed tricks like sitting, staying, and giving high fives, much to James's delight. After lunch, David suggested they take a break. They sat on the patio, sipping lemonade while Buddy lounged in the grass. "You know," David said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I've had Buddy since he was a puppy. Back then, I didn't know the first thing about taking care of a dog. It was a learning curve." James looked up, surprised. "Really? You seem like an expert now." David chuckled. "I've had years to figure it out, but you've got a natural gift, James. You understand animals in a way that not everyone does." James felt a swell of pride at David's words. "Thanks. I really like dogs. They're always there for you, no matter what." David nodded thoughtfully. "That's true. Dogs teach us a lot about loyalty and unconditional love." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the yard, James felt a deep sense of contentment. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't thinking about the challenges waiting back home, the bills his mom worried about, the smallness of their apartment. Here, with Buddy by his side, he felt free. Before driving James home, David pulled him aside. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "You've got a real talent for this, James, and I think you could do even more with it." James tilted his head, curious. "What do you mean?" "You'll see," David said, a mysterious smile on his face. "But first, let's make this a regular thing. How about every Saturday, you come over and help me with Buddy?" James's face lit up. "Really? You mean it?" "Absolutely," David said, extending his hand. "Deal. Deal," James replied, shaking his hand enthusiastically. As they drove back to Southside, James leaned against the window, a small smile on his face. He couldn't wait to tell his mom about the day, and more than that, he couldn't wait for the next Saturday. Later that evening, as David sat in his quiet home, he found himself replaying the day in his mind. The house, though grand and luxurious, felt emptier than ever. He glanced over at Buddy, who lay sprawled on the living room rug, his tail thumping softly against the floor. The dog seemed more relaxed than usual, as if James's presence had brought a lightness to their home that lingered even after the boy had left. David leaned back in his leather armchair, nursing a glass of water. He rarely allowed himself time to reflect. His life was a whirlwind of meetings, deadlines, and constant decision-making. But today had been different. James's earnestness and unfiltered joy had stirred something in him, something he hadn't felt in years. He stood up, walking over to the large window that overlooked the backyard. The patio lights cast a warm glow on the neatly trimmed lawn, where James and Buddy had spent the afternoon playing. It was the first time in months that David had truly taken a step back to enjoy the simpler things in life. "Funny, isn't it, Buddy?" he said softly, turning to look at the dog. "A 10-year-old kid manages to teach me more in one day than I've learned in years." Buddy perked up at the sound of David's voice, trotting over to nuzzle his hand. David knelt down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "He's a good kid, isn't he? Brave, kind, full of heart. Makes you wonder how he stayed that way, growing up in a world like this." David's thoughts drifted back to his own childhood. He hadn't grown up with wealth, far from it. His parents had struggled to make ends meet, and he'd learned early on that success was something you had to fight for. But in chasing that success, he'd lost sight of the things that truly mattered. Relationships, community, the kind of simple joys James had reminded him of today. He straightened up, his jaw tightening with determination. "Maybe it's time to start giving back," he said aloud, more to himself than to Buddy. "Maybe it's time to do something that actually makes a difference." The thought lingered as David sat back down, pulling his laptop onto his lap. He opened a blank document, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. An idea had been forming in the back of his mind all day. inspired by James's courage and compassion. He didn't have all the details yet, but he knew one thing for certain. This wouldn't be just a one-time gesture. He wanted to create something lasting, something that could help others like James and make a real impact. Buddy trotted over, resting his head on David's knee. David smiled, rubbing the dog's head. "This is all because of you, you know. If you hadn't been in that alley, I never would have met James. And I think he's going to change more lives than he realizes." As the night deepened, David typed furiously, his vision taking shape with each word. He wasn't just building something for James. He was building something for the city, for the animals and people who needed a second chance, just like Buddy had needed a second chance in that alley. When he finally closed his laptop, the clock read past midnight, but David didn't feel tired. For the first time in years, he felt energized, driven by a purpose that extended beyond himself. "Tomorrow's the start of something new," he said, looking down at Buddy. "And it's all thanks to that kid with the big heart." Buddy wagged his tail as if he understood, his eyes warm and trusting. David smiled, giving him one last pat before heading upstairs. He fell asleep that night with a sense of clarity and resolve, knowing that he was about to embark on a journey that would not only change his life but the lives of many others as well. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. David threw himself into his new project, spending hours researching, drafting proposals, and reaching out to contacts. The idea had taken hold of him, an organization dedicated to rescuing and caring for abandoned animals, while also educating the community about empathy and responsibility. He decided to name it the Buddy Foundation, after the dog who had inadvertently brought James into his life. At first, David wasn't sure how to get started. Running a business was one thing, but creating a nonprofit with a meaningful mission was an entirely different challenge. Still, he was determined to see it through. He contacted animal shelters, spoke with veterinarians, and sought advice from community leaders. His name carried weight in Chicago's business world, and soon, people began to take notice of his plans. One Saturday morning, as James arrived at David's estate for his now regular visits with Buddy, he found David in the middle of a makeshift office in the dining room. Papers were scattered across the long table, alongside blueprints, charts, and a whiteboard filled with handwritten notes. "What's all this?" James asked, setting his backpack down and looking curiously at the chaos. David looked up, smiling. "This," he said, gesturing to the mess, "is the beginning of something big. Come here. I want to show you." James approached, his eyes scanning the whiteboard. Phrases like animal rescue, community outreach, and education programs jumped out at him. "I'm starting something called the Buddy Foundation," David explained, his voice filled with excitement. "It's going to be an organization that helps animals like Buddy, and people too. We'll rescue pets, provide care, and teach people how to take care of them properly." James's eyes lit up. "That's so cool. But why people too?" "Because animals and people are connected," David said. "Just like you and Buddy. You didn't just save him that day. He saved you too, in a way, didn't he?" James nodded slowly, thinking about how much brighter his life had felt since Buddy came into it. "Yeah, I guess he did." David leaned forward, his expression serious but warm. "That's why I want you to be a part of this, James. You've got the kind of heart that inspires people. I want you to be the Foundation's first ambassador." James blinked, caught off guard. "Ambassador? What does that mean?" "It means you'll share your story," David said. "You'll talk to other kids, maybe even adults, about what it means to care for animals and why it's so important. You'll inspire people to help, just like you inspired me." James hesitated, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. "But I'm just a kid. What if people don't listen to me?" "They will," David said confidently, "because you're proof that one person, no matter how young, can make a difference. Besides, you've got Buddy on your side. Who wouldn't want to listen to you with him around?" James laughed, glancing at Buddy, who was sitting nearby with his head tilted, as if he understood every word. "Okay," James said finally. "I'll do it." David smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. Together, we're going to change lives, James. I can feel it." In the months that followed, the Buddy Foundation began to take shape. David secured funding through his connections and launched a social media campaign to spread the word. He arranged partnerships with local shelters and veterinarians, while James attended community events with Buddy, sharing their story and encouraging others to get involved. The foundation's first major event was a rescue drive held at a local park. Families gathered with their pets, and volunteers helped match abandoned animals with loving homes. James stood at the front of the crowd, holding Buddy's leash as he addressed the audience. "This is Buddy," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "A few months ago, I found him in an alley, scared and alone. I couldn't leave him there. And now, he's not just my friend. He's my hero." That's why the Buddy Foundation exists, to help animals like Buddy and remind people that we all have the power to make a difference. The crowd erupted into applause, and James felt a wave of pride and gratitude wash over him. He looked down at Buddy, who wagged his tail as if to say, "You did good, kid." David stood at the edge of the crowd, watching with a satisfied smile. He knew that this was just the beginning. The Buddy Foundation wasn't just about saving animals. It was about building a legacy of compassion, one that would ripple through the city and beyond. James's new role as the first ambassador of the Buddy Foundation quickly became a life-changing experience. He had always been a shy boy, someone who avoided the spotlight, but something about the foundation, its mission, its purpose, made him step out of his comfort zone. Every time he stood in front of a crowd, holding Buddy's leash, he felt a spark of confidence he never knew he had. David wasted no time introducing James to new opportunities. Within weeks of the foundation's launch, James was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even local news stations. His story, simple but heartfelt, resonated with people of all ages. At one of his first events, a crowded auditorium filled with students from various Chicago schools, James stood nervously behind the podium. Buddy sat beside him, wagging his tail as if to say, "You've got this." The murmurs in the room quieted as James began to speak. "Hi, everyone," he started, his voice a little shaky but growing steadier with each word. "My name is James Walker, and this is Buddy. A few months ago, Buddy was just a dog tied up in an alley, scared and alone. But that day, something changed. For both of us." He paused, glancing at the audience. Dozens of eyes were locked on him, listening intently. Encouraged, he continued, "When I saved Buddy, I didn't just save his life. He saved mine too. Spending time with him showed me how important it is to care for animals and to see the world through their eyes. That's why I'm here, to tell you that you can make a difference too. Whether it's rescuing a stray, volunteering at a shelter, or just being kind to the animals around you, every action counts." The room erupted into applause, and James felt a rush of pride and relief. He glanced down at Buddy, who barked as if joining the ovation. After the event, a group of students approached James, their faces lit up with enthusiasm. One girl, about his age, spoke up. "That was so cool, James. I've always wanted to help animals, but I didn't know how. How do I get involved?" James smiled, thrilled to see others inspired by his story. "You can start small," he said. "Talk to your parents about volunteering at a shelter or organizing a donation drive. Even just spreading the word about animals in need helps." By the end of the day, James had spoken to dozens of kids, sharing tips, listening to their ideas, and encouraging them to take action. For the first time, he felt like his voice truly mattered. As his role expanded, James became a familiar face in the community. Local news outlets featured his story, dubbing him Chicago's young hero. David often accompanied him to events, standing proudly in the background as James and Buddy captivated audiences. One evening, after a particularly successful fundraiser, James and David sat together in the estate's living room. Buddy lay at their feet, chewing on a new toy someone had donated at the event. "You were amazing tonight, James," David said, leaning back in his chair. "Every time you speak, you inspire more people. You're the heart of this foundation." James looked up, a small smile on his face. "I couldn't do it without Buddy. Or you." David shook his head. "Don't sell yourself short. You've got something special, a way of connecting with people that makes them believe in what we're doing. I can see it every time they come up to you after an event." James hesitated, then asked, Do you think we're really making a difference? David leaned forward, his expression serious. Absolutely. Every animal we save, every family we inspire to adopt, every person who learns to treat animals with kindness, that's a difference. And it's because of you. James nodded, his confidence growing. I want to keep doing this. I want to help as many animals as I can. And you will, David said, smiling. This is just the beginning. In the months that followed, the Buddy Foundation grew beyond anything David or James had imagined. Donations poured in, allowing them to expand their operations, hire staff, and rescue more animals. James continued to serve as the foundation's ambassador, his bond with Buddy becoming a symbol of the organization's mission. Through his efforts, James not only changed the lives of countless animals, but also inspired a new generation of advocates. Kids who once felt powerless began to see themselves as agents of change, just like James. And every time he stood before a crowd, sharing his story with Buddy by his side, James knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The Buddy Foundation quickly became a cornerstone of the Chicago community. What had started as a single act of kindness, James rescuing Buddy from a dangerous alley, had grown into a movement that touched the lives of thousands. The organization not only saved countless animals, but also brought people together in a way that David had never anticipated. James's role as the foundation's ambassador flourished. By now, he had spoken at schools across the city, his story sparking a wave of youth-driven volunteerism. Kids began organizing local adoption events, setting up pet food drives, and even creating art to raise awareness about animal care. Every time James saw one of these efforts, his heart swelled with pride. One sunny Saturday, the Buddy Foundation hosted its largest event yet, a citywide adoption fair at Millennium Park. Booths lined the pathways, filled with adoptable dogs, cats, and even rabbits. Families strolled through the event, laughter and excitement filling the air. Volunteers handed out pamphlets, offered pet care advice, and guided prospective pet owners through the adoption process. James and Buddy had their own booth, where they greeted visitors and answered questions. Buddy wore a bandana with the foundation's logo, wagging his tail enthusiastically as children came up to pet him. "Is this the dog you rescued?" a little boy asked, his wide eyes filled with awe. "Yep," James replied, kneeling down to the boy's level. "This is Buddy. He's the reason all of this is happening." The boy beamed, petting Buddy gently. "I want to help animals too when I grow up." "You don't have to wait until you grow up," James said, smiling. "You can start now. Even small things, like being kind to animals or helping out at a shelter, make a big difference." Nearby, David watched the interaction, a sense of fulfillment washing over him. The boy he'd met months ago in the middle of a chaotic rescue had grown into a confident young leader, inspiring others to care about the world around them. It was a transformation David had been privileged to witness, and it reaffirmed his belief in the Foundation's mission. Later that afternoon, as the adoption fair wound down, David and James stood together, surveying the crowd. Families left with their newly adopted pets, smiles on their faces and hope in their hearts. Volunteers packed up supplies, their exhaustion mingled with a sense of accomplishment. "We did good today," David said, clapping James on the shoulder. "We did," James agreed, his gaze drifting to a family walking away with a golden retriever puppy. "It feels good, knowing we're helping." David nodded, his voice thoughtful. "It's not just about the animals, you know? It's about building connections, between people, between families. Animals have a way of bringing out the best in us, and you've shown people how powerful that can be." James looked up at David, a spark of determination in his eyes. "I want to keep doing this, Mr. Monroe, not just here in Chicago, everywhere. There are so many animals that need help." David smiled, his pride in James evident. "And we will. This is just the beginning." Over the next few years, the Buddy Foundation expanded beyond Chicago, establishing branches in cities across the United States. Each new location carried the same mission: to rescue animals, educate communities, and foster compassion. James's story remained at the heart of the Foundation's message, a reminder of how one small act of bravery could ripple outward, creating a legacy of kindness. James and David's bond grew stronger with each passing year, their friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. Buddy, now a little grayer around the muzzle but just as spirited, remained a constant companion, a living symbol of the Foundation's success. As James stood on stage at a national conference, sharing his journey with an audience of thousands, he realized how far they had come. The boy who had once felt powerless now knew that he could change the world, one life, one act of kindness at a time. And it all started with Buddy. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and watch this next story, which is incredibly moving.